Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are making basically a copycat recipe of some of Dave's killer bread. And this is I'll put it on the screen. This is the one that's like super seedy. It was Thanksgiving and we had a 15-pound turkey and only 3 people for Thanksgiving. And so we had a lot of turkey left over. And what is the weekend after Thanksgiving without turkey sandwiches? And so I decided that I was going to make some bread. I used to make bread all the time. And so this is basically the knowledge that I have from many, many years of making bread at least weekly. But I haven't done that a lot in the last 10 years. So I got online, I kind of looked at the ingredients from the bag of bread and saw what was in it and looked at some copycat recipes, which made a lot of changes that I wasn't really in the direction I wanted to go. I like Dave's bread because it's whole grain, so it uses 100% whole wheat flour. And then it has lots of seeds in it, which actually adds a lot to the taste. What I ended up doing was I took the list of seeds and grains that were in this loaf and I just ground them instead of having some of them sprinkled on top of the loaf. They look really pretty sprinkled on top of the loaf, but the problem with that is they just fall off and they make a mess. And so I'm constantly picking them up. I'm mostly not eating them. And so I opted to not do that. You certainly could if you wanted to set a little bit of this aside and just stick it on the top of the loaf with like an egg wash. That's very fiddly to me and not really what I wanted to do. So I just ground all the seeds and grains that went into this in a small spice grinder and then went from there. This recipe is by weight. If you make bread on a regular basis, I highly, highly recommend starting to do recipes by weight rather than volume. Volume can vary quite a bit just depending on how fluffy it is, whether you've sifted it or not, whether it's been sitting for a long time and it's really dried out, or you live in a humid climate and it's absorbed a lot of moisture from the air. And so if you want consistent results, and also if you're testing recipes and you want to tweak them, it's very, very helpful to work in weight, because then you know, oh, I used 16 ounces in this. It was a little bit dry. Maybe I want to use slightly less flour in this next loaf, or maybe I want to increase the moisture slightly. The other thing professional bread bakers do is they work in something called a baker's percentage. And that is how much hydration the loaf has is based on the total weight of the grains, and then some percentage of that, usually between 55 and 75, is how much water is in the loaf. And you can't do that by volume easily. You need to be able to do that by weight. I have a standard 1-pound loaf of bread that I've been making variations on for probably 20 years. And I have a blog post on this written up if you want to read it. And so basically that's where I started. And so I ended up with 3 ounces of the mixed grains and seeds and nuts that go into this, including some vital wheat gluten. And vital wheat gluten is basically when you have a whole grain loaf of bread, so a whole wheat loaf of bread, that contains the bran and the germ. And the bran especially is kind of like little scissors, and it tends to cut gluten strands. And so adding some extra gluten to a whole wheat loaf will give you a much better rise. They always are going to be more dense than a light, fluffy Wonder Bread type of loaf, but adding some extra vital wheat gluten is going to make a huge difference in terms of your rise. And we're embracing the gluten in this recipe. It's not like we're trying to do a gluten-free loaf. If you want a gluten-free loaf, I have a recipe for that as well, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But we're embracing the gluten, and so adding some extra gluten to this is not going to hurt anything. I'm using fresh ground whole wheat flour in this, and it is a hard white wheat. And hard white wheat, just you can usually get hard red wheat or hard white wheat. Hard red wheat is a little bit darker and more pungent in color and flavor. Hard white wheat tends to be just a little bit lighter. It's still a whole grain. Just because it says white does not mean it's white bread. It just means that it's a lighter color. Part of what makes a hard wheat versus a soft wheat is the amount of protein in the bread, which equates to the amount of gluten in the bread. And so a soft white wheat, those are used for things like pastries. They tend to be, 9 or 10% in terms of protein content. For a hard wheat, you want it to be around 12 to 14. And that just is going to give you more gluten, which is going to give you more lift. I made this from home ground whole wheat flour. You can certainly just go to the store and buy whole wheat flour. I highly recommend either Bob's Red Mill or King Arthur. Both of those are very good quality whole wheat flours. If you don't want a lot of residual pesticides in your wheat, not just from when it was growing, but actually from how it was stored, because when they're storing wheat in giant grain silos, they need to put a lot of stuff on them to kill all the bugs, to maintain humidity, to keep things from rotting. Buy organic, or organic is going to have less pesticides, and it's pesticides with a shorter shelf life. And so if you can spend the money and you can afford it and you care about that stuff, organic whole wheat flour is going to be less pesticide residue. So this came out really good. Is it exactly a duplicate? No. Can I slice this as thin as the thin sliced that comes in the loaf? No. And so it's going to be a little bit more caloric than, I think the thin sliced stuff is 60 calories a slice. Dave's Killer Bread loaf is 20.5 ounces. And this loaf, when I took it out of the oven and it had cooled off, weighed between 26 and 27 ounces. And so it's a little bit bigger loaf, so bigger to start with. And then some tweaks I made in the recipe that I'll explain in the video are going to give it a few more calories, but really delicious. Came out great. I was really pleased with the loft on this. It got some very nice height. And so I think this is a good recipe. So Copycat, Dave's Killer Bread recipe. Let's get started. Here's the seed and nut mix going into this. Don't feel married to this. You could probably play around with it. I just went with what was on the back of the bag because I happen to have that. So a couple tablespoons of rolled oats, and this is my little spice grinder, some flaxseed, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, a mixed colored quinoa, and then I'm just gonna grind all of that together. I love this little spice mule, particularly because the cup comes out and so you can actually wash it. And also because the plastic fits around the outside rather than the inside, and so it does not chip over time. So here's our grain mix. And then to this, I'm going to add a couple tablespoons of oat bran and then the vital wheat gluten. So this is the vital wheat gluten going in. When I measure all of that out, it's 3 ounces. And because I want 16 ounces total, I'm going to add my fresh ground wheat flour. And honestly, this isn't fresh ground. I actually keep it in the refrigerator. But I'm going to add that to where I have a total of a pound of grains, so 16 ounces. So to 10 ounces of warm water, but not too warm, because if it's too hot, it'll kill the yeast, I'm adding 2.5 teaspoons of yeast. And I just buy it bulk. You can use instant or regular. I don't think it makes a huge difference, but I like to bloom it ahead of time. And so that's what this is doing, letting it soak up and rehydrate and then giving that a swirl just to make sure there's nothing stuck on the bottom. And then this is optional. So a couple tablespoons of oil, you could use butter, and then a couple tablespoons of honey. The recipe from Dave's uses fruit juices for sweetening, so I wasn't going to bother with that. So a couple tablespoons of honey. And then I stir this together with the end of a wooden spoon. You can put this on your stand mixer and put the hook in and let the hook do this work, but it takes 3 or 4 minutes to come together if you do it that way. And if you just stir it by hand with the end of a spoon, it comes together very quickly. I'm going to let that hydrate for about 20 minutes before I start mixing it. After it hydrates, then I'm going to add the salt. It's called an autolyse when you let it sit like that. The salt inhibits some of that enzymatic reaction, so you don't want to add your salt too soon. And then 20 minutes of kneading time. So a very long knead here. We are really trying to form as much gluten as possible. And I got this trick from watching YouTube videos of people that do whole wheat flour bread all the time, and that was one of the big tips, was knead it way longer than you think you're going to need it. Most conventional recipes for a bread are going to be 5 minutes of kneading, and this was 20. This would be very hard to do by hand, but you certainly could if you had really good arm strength. And then I'm just kind of rolling that in order to create a smooth top there. It's pretty sticky, and I want it to be fairly sticky. Whole wheat flours tend to be a little bit drier and need more moisture in order to fully hydrate and come out well. And then this is called the window pane test, where you're supposed to be able to pull it and not have it tear. Clearly it's tearing anyway, but there is so much stuff in there that I wasn't too worried about it.
And then I'm gonna let that sit for an hour. So this is after an hour of rising. And I just use the same container because why get a second container dirty when it's not necessary? Light sprinkle of flour. I'm gonna scrape that out of my bowl and gently flatten it out. And I'm gonna try for a rectangle here. And so I'm gonna shape my loaf first by patting it into a rectangle shape. And I want that rectangle to be just slightly less wide than the actual bread pan that I'm putting this in. And this is just a standard Pyrex bread pan. And I have several others, but this is a nice size for this particular loaf. You're gonna roll that about a quarter of the way up and then roll your corners in. I got this tip from, I think, King Arthur Flour from a YouTube video. And then every time you roll it, tuck that edge in. And that is gonna keep you from getting air pockets as it rises again. Tucking your ends in, rolling, tucking down, rolling, tucking down, so that it's very well attached. And you want to notice there is no flour on the side that I'm rolling this. If you put a bunch of flour in there, you're going to potentially get an air pocket. And then I ended up a little bit longer than my actual loaf pan, and so I'm tucking the ends under and just kind of squeezing to try to make this as even as possible. It wasn't perfect, but it's in the ballpark. And, you know, rustic loaf, handmade, I'm not too worried about it being perfect. And then you're going to want to spray your bread pan or it's going to stick. I'm going to put that in my bread pan, cover it lightly with some beeswax cloth. You could use plastic wrap here too, but basically you don't want it to seal because it's going to grow. Half an hour later, preheat your oven to 350. This is what it looks like after a 30-minute rise. And then while the oven is preheating, here is after another 15 minutes. So that's a 45-minute rise in the bread pan. And then into the oven it goes. And 350 for 45 minutes. And that is just kind of my standard baking time for any loaf that's this size. I've been doing this way for years. It seems to come out very nicely. And there you have it. You get a little bit of oven spring. You see that line right along the lip of the container. That's oven spring where it rose in the oven itself. And then I'm going to immediately turn that out onto a cooling rack. And then once it's completely cool, you can cut it, but you don't want to cut it before that or it gets really gluey. So here's what it looks like cut. Having a serrated bread knife is very nice. We were actually making turkey sandwiches this night, which is why we had this out. But nice, fine grain, relatively fluffy, no big holes, and all of those grains are just incorporated into the loaf. Very, very nice. So here's Dave's list of ingredients from their thin sliced Powerseed loaf. And this is a little bit hard to read. It kind of is overwhelming. And notice they include a little bit of vinegar, some cultured wheat flour, organic cherry powder, I don't know what that's about, and some enzymes. That's basically indicating they've got some kind of fermentation going on ahead of time. Here's the simplified version of that same list, taking out a lot of that wordage and breaking it up so that you can actually read it. Potentially a little bit of sourdough action going on in here. That's usually how enzymes are indicated. Here's my loaf. And so instead of the fruit juice, I used honey, and then I added the avocado oil, and then I cut out the weird cherry stuff. And then obviously I'm not doing a fermented loaf here, and so there isn't any enzymes included. So here's a comparison in terms of calories and carb, protein, fat, fiber, and sodium in grams of the two different recipes. So Dave's on the left, mine on the right. Dave's loaf is smaller at 20.5 ounces. Mine is 26.5 ounces, so bigger. Dave's is less calories, but we'll get to that. There's some interesting math going on there that I don't really understand. Carbs, if you subtract the fiber, because fiber doesn't actually really get digested, and so even though it's included in the carbs normally on a label, it doesn't really count towards carbs. So this is carbs minus the fiber. You can do a comparison there. Protein, fat, obviously mine's more fat because I did add the avocado oil to the recipe in order to get a little bit more tender crumb. I'm guessing theirs has more vital wheat gluten in it, which is probably why the protein content is a little bit higher with theirs. Mine is much less sodium. Look at the difference in the sodium there. Literally about 3 times as much sodium. If you're watching your sodium, make your own bread. Don't buy it from the store. And then here it is broken down by actual calorie. And the way you do this is a gram of protein or a gram of carbohydrates is 4 calories. And so you just multiply the number of grams of protein or carbs in a recipe by 4, and you should get the total number of calories from that thing. And then fat is 9 calories per gram, not 4, which is why fat adds so many calories to products. This is just interesting. I'm not really that interested in the calories in terms of watching my calories. It's just interesting to see how it all plays out. The interesting part of this is you can do this by math, or you can actually do it by testing, where they put it into an oven and cook it to where it's ash and then look at how much heat it generated. And then that's the definition of calories in terms of how that's technically, scientifically defined. And the difference between what they're saying their loaf is versus when you do the math, what the loaf is quite a bit different. So their total calories comes out to 1260 if you just multiply a single slice by 21, which is how many slices are in the loaf. But when you actually do the math and add it up, it comes out to 1376. So a dramatic difference in calories there for the whole loaf. And then mine, similar, I had ChatGPT calculate the nutrition and calories on my recipe, and the difference between what you get in terms of the whole loaf versus doing the math. Mine comes out smaller instead of bigger. So I don't know what's going on here. Calories are complicated, evidently. There's more to it than that. But you get a rough idea that mine is somewhere around double the number of calories per slice of bread. And to some extent that makes sense because mine has more fat in it, and it's also just simply a bigger slice and a bigger loaf. I think I estimated that I would get about 17 slices per loaf, and my loaf weighed quite a bit more. But this was a fun experiment, and I enjoyed actually looking at the calories as well and breaking down the nutrition on it. So if you guys are looking to make something similar at home, give this recipe a try, tribe, and feel free to tweak it to your heart's content. If you keep the total ounces of grains at around 3 ounces, mix and match whatever you like, whatever you've got on hand in your own cupboards, and then do the rest with whole wheat flour and then add some of that vital wheat gluten, you should come out pretty good even if you're changing it up a bit. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.